Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hi there, I'm Wendy Block, Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy for the Michigan Chamber and today's podcast host. Today we're going to talk about a troubling ranking that Michigan received earlier this year, and that's our capital city, Lansing, for the first time landing on the Judicial Hellholes list. A warm welcome to our guest today, Lauren Sheets Jarrell, Vice President and General Counsel for the American Tort Reform Association in Washington, D.C. Lauren is the lead analyst and author of the group's annual Judicial Hellholes report and where our state ranking came from. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started. Thanks, Lauren, for joining us. And let's start with some background about you and your work with the American Tort Reform Association. Can you give our listeners a snapshot of ATRA and the work that you do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Wendy, for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So ATRA is the first national organization that's exclusively dedicated to reforming the civil justice system. We work mainly at the state level, and we work together with state coalitions and chambers like the Michigan Chamber. And through our work, we advocate for legislative reforms. We have a very robust public affairs and communications program, and then we participate in the courts through our amicus program. As you mentioned, I am currently Vice President and Counsel for ATRA. I've been with the organization for 13 years, and I oversee our amicus program and the substantive aspects of our public affairs and communications activities. And as you mentioned, most importantly, for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm the lead author of our annual Judicial Hellholes program.
Great. So just to maybe level set, we talk about civil justice system. Can you just give our authors kind of an idea of what you mean when you say that word, right? I think a lot of people hear it and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. But what does that really mean?
We look at the liability system in states and the what's occurring in the civil courts and the laws that are on the books for defendants.
Okay, so great. So ATRA earlier this year unveiled its latest Judicial Hellholes report. I think you've been doing this for a number of years, if not decades. And it really wasn't great news for Michigan, right? With our capital city making the list at number 6 and debuting as a first-timer. So first, maybe could you tell us how this report came to be and what the process and criteria is for being included on this kind of awful hellholes list?
The report began more than 20 years ago. I think we're on our 23rd edition this year, and it's released annually in December. And it's a way to shine a spotlight on the worst abuses that are occurring in the civil justice system. It aims to be a catalyst for change by spotlighting these abuses at the state level, and through both the courts and state legislatures, we're hoping to urge them to reform and make some changes. This past year, we named 9 judicial hellholes, and for the first time ever in the history of the report, we actually named co-number ones with Georgia and the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court taking the top spot. And in order to compile the report, we actually begin about mid-year, and we dig through judicial opinions and dockets. We survey our membership and talk to local defense counsel across the country to hear what's happening in the courts and what's happening on the ground. And then we compile the report and results through what we learn there. We identify courts that are adopting novel theories of liability and are drastically expanding liability and have uneven playing fields. That's really what it's all about, is making sure that both parties have a level playing field when they walk into the courtroom and that they're both being treated fairly.
Okay, gotcha. So it sounds like the goal here is to really get people's attention, to bring people's attention to kind of what is happening across our nation in terms of the civil justice system. But, you know, it seems like it's kind of unusual for a legislature or a capital city like Lansing to actually end up on a list like this, right? You talk about how in a lot of states you're talking about the courts ending up on this list. So can you talk a little bit about why Lansing ended up on this list and some of those specific findings? And, you know, frankly, this is a lot of these issues that the Michigan Chamber has been working on, right?
Yes, it is. We've enjoyed partnering with you all. And So Lansing debuted at number 6 this year, which is a fairly high ranking for a first-time Hellholes designee. But we were very concerned about the direction of the state Supreme Court and the aggressive liability expanding agenda that's being pursued by the state legislature. Specifically, the state's debut on the list reflects the state Supreme Court's expansion of premises and medical liability, along with these pro-plaintiff legislative changes that were both enacted and still being considered in the legislature. On the premises liability front, the Michigan Supreme Court last year overturned a long-standing framework for slip and fall cases, impacting property and small business owners, and could really lead to a surge in these types of cases. The decision impacted property owners by altering the open and obvious doctrine that had previously shielded property owners for decades. So what this means in practicality is that landowners may now face liability even in instances where dangers were considered open and obvious. They were easily seen. And as I mentioned, this concept had protected them for years. Now these cases will be decided by juries rather than the court, and it will likely lead to more time-consuming and costly legal proceedings, which will just increase that burden that businesses in Michigan face and landowners. On the medical liability front, the Supreme Court decided to overturn precedents that may now encourage more frivolous lawsuits. And when you see a rise in frivolous lawsuits, it drives up the health care costs and impacts the availability of high-quality health care for families. The court decided that although an affidavit of merit remains a requirement, it no longer has to be filed within the statute of limitations. And an affidavit of merit is signed by a medical expert, and it's crucial to validating a plaintiff's claim against a healthcare provider. And it really serves to deter frivolous claims. So by overruling this requirement, Michigan, again, may see a surge in medical liability cases that lack necessary merit, which once again will increase the burden on the legal system and on medical practitioners. And another case that we are paying close attention to is the Attorney General's consumer protection case against Eli Lilly. The Michigan Supreme Court is reviewing a lower court decision that drastically expanded liability for regulated industries. And if the court doesn't rein in liability under the state's consumer protection statute, it will lead to further deterioration of the state's civil justice system and will place an onerous burden on already regulated industries in the state. And lastly, I just want to briefly mention some legislative activity, which we alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. One bill that passed in 2023 that was highlighted in the report is Senate Bill 410. And this is a piece of legislation that will have significant implications for healthcare providers and patient safety. What it did was it repealed an existing liability protection for drug and device manufacturers when the products are FDA approved. This undid a 23-year-old liability protection that existed in the state and aligned the state law with FDA judgments on drug safety. So by removing these protections, these cases are now going to be resolved on a case-by-case basis, which really injects a lot of uncertainty into Michigan's legal landscape and potentially burdens healthcare professionals, product manufacturers, and again, most importantly, patients in the state. And I'll point out, many other states have opted for a more balanced approach with regards to this type of liability by providing manufacturers with a rebuttable presumption of non-liability when their product is approved by the FDA. Mm-hmm. So in this approach, respects the expertise of the federal regulators while still allowing patients legal recourse when necessary.
Right. And I should mention on that consumer protection case, that case is currently pending before the Michigan Supreme Court as well. So there's legislation, but there's also a case pending before the Michigan Supreme Court, and ATRA and the Michigan Chamber and a number of other business and trade associations, both in state and nationally, have partnered together in an amicus brief on that because it looks on its face to be an insulin case, an Eli Lilly case, but really it could open the door to lawsuits, including class action lawsuits against over 80 different regulated entities and professions if the Supreme Court were to overturn longstanding legal precedent in that regard. So I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about the net effect of this. It seems like this kind of ranking doesn't bode well for a state's business climate, right? And, we know that a state's litigation climate matters for employers who are considering growth and expansion in a given state. How much of a factor would you say this really is? Is this, just kind of something that someone says is important, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter? I imagine that maybe you would say differently.
Absolutely. This is a very important factor when companies are deciding where to operate or looking to expand. We've seen businesses fleeing a state like California that is probably the worst, one of the worst of the worst, a perennial judicial hellhole for states like Texas and Florida. And while taxes and other things play a role in this decision, the abusive civil justice system plays a very important role as well. And it's especially important for small businesses because many of them don't have the ability to absorb the rising litigation costs and are forced to close when faced with frivolous lawsuits. I'd like to point out, each year there's a study that's an economic impact study that is released about the impact of excessive tort costs on state economies. And in Michigan, this most recent report estimated that the excessive costs associated with lawsuit abuse generates an individual tort tax of more than $1,000 each year, or $4,000 more for a family of four. Additionally, it leads to an annual loss of more than 97,000 jobs and $10.5 million in GDP loss. And again, this is because the state litigation climate has a very real impact on business decisions. And as I mentioned, when faced with these frivolous lawsuits, small businesses and others will either leave the state or shut down altogether. So it's important to understand that these decisions don't only impact business, but they really impact hardworking Michigan families by increasing the cost and uncertainty in the civil justice system.
Yeah. It affects things like insurability too, right? I mean, if there's such a exposure to liability, it's often insurance companies that pay out these claims. And then when they have to pay out these claims, they subsequently have to raise premiums, which are absorbed by businesses as well. Is that not right?
Exactly. In many judicial hellholes, we are seeing insurance crises with companies either leaving the markets altogether or really increasing policy premiums exponentially to handle these additional litigation costs. Again, there's other reasons that contribute, but one of the most important driving factors is lawsuit abuse and what we call a rise in nuclear verdicts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we always like to close with just kind of one big takeaway or one big thing. So what is one thing that you think our listeners, business leaders, and really all of Michigan should take away from our conversation today or no?
I think it's the impact and the importance that this has for the average Michigander and how this impacts everyone in the state, and the importance of addressing the lawsuit abuse that is occurring, and to make sure that you're telling your story and that key leadership is aware of the impact it's having so that they are putting the best interests of every family in Michigan and every small business first and not just the profit motives of the trial bar. Yeah, that's a great takeaway. So, Lauren, our time has gone by very quickly. A special thank you to you as well as our listeners. You can learn more about the Judicial Hellholes report at judicialhellholes.org and get involved today. Otherwise, tune into our next episode and subscribe or like our podcast for easy notifications. Until next time, thank you.